Mary the Egyptian was an important early desert ascetic for whom the Byzantine tradition, that would be our Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Coptic fellow Christians, she's still remembered in their calendar of liturgies. She's mostly forgotten in the West, although she's technically still on our calendar in the Latin Rite. We don't know a whole lot about Mary as an historical person. She probably died around 430, 431. Scholars now believe she was from southern Egypt or Sudan, somewhere in the lower regions. In medieval ages, they attributed her darkened skin that the early paintings of her on frescoes and early icons as darkened skin to the fact that she had lived in the desert for so many years. And now they're saying, no, she was from the southern part of the Nile Delta region and that she had naturally darker skin. That probably isn't so much important, but her story was preserved primarily to edify or convert monastics. It was not originally for the laity, although they loved her story, and that's why it got passed on over and over again. But it was to teach monastics true humility. But also, people love a good story, don't we? There's basically three origin stories. One or two are more reasonable than the other. One is that she had been a former nun, but it really doesn't fit in with certain circumstances of the story that have been saved throughout the ages. One is that she, although had been raised a Christian, decided to live a more licentious life. And for about 17 years, they say that she supported herself weaving linen, but she really liked to hang out with the guys, and she was kind of notorious for seducing them. But one day she follows a group of pilgrims to Jerusalem, more out of curiosity and also eyeing, good, handsome looking young men. But it turns out that this pilgrimage was to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, also known as the Church of the Resurrection, for a service known as the Elevation of the Precious Cross. But she didn't quite know that. She was just following the crowd along. And she gets to the church and she tries to pass through the doorway, and there's a force that stops her from being able to go through, kind of like an invisible barrier from Star Trek or something. But, she tries to go through, pushes her back. She tries to go through, pushes her back, and she really starts weeping, and she's not sure why, but she just starts crying and crying, and she's out in the courtyard. And I think it's more than frustration that led her to this. And she glances up at the stone wall, and there she sees an image of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And that image convicts her that she needs to turn her life around, that she was not worthy, literally, to pass through the doorway to go worship the cross. And it's kind of like there's a silent dialogue between Mary, the Egyptian, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and like a kind of catechesis that takes place. And Mary, the Egyptian, comes to see that she had to absolutely turn her life around, that she was not worthy of God. She was not worthy of, that's from her perspective. Of course, we know God that believes all are worthy, but she does turn her life around, and then she's allowed to pass through the doorway, and she goes with other pilgrims and worships at the remnant of the Holy Cross, weeping and weeping and crying and crying. This is a really important theology that comes out of the desert called penthos, which is the gift or the capacity for profound repentance, turning our life around. She comes back out again to the courtyard, and again she sees the image of Mary, and she makes her confession to Mary. Mary extends forgiveness to her, and then Mary the Egyptian says, I'm committing my desert journey to you, and I'm asking you to help me to be faithful. So we have a situation here where a woman confesses to a woman who extends the sacrament of reconciliation, as we'll call it later on, from Mary, the mother of Jesus, back to Mary the Egyptian. And she heads out into the desert where her story will continue. The other possibility, which I think has equal weight, and this is one that some Orthodox scholars, especially men, are beginning to put forward as maybe the more likely story. Not that she had been living a promiscuous life for years and then had this conversion experience, but that she had been a liturgical musician in Jerusalem. And men started accusing her of allowing her beauty to seduce them, as if it's a woman's responsibility to contain men's sexual feelings, or whatever you want to call it. Long history of this in Christianity, projecting onto women. I've teased my students that church history is one where women are responsible for all sexual sin in humanity. No, not at all. But this was not uncommon as a way to push a woman out of power. It happened before Mary the Egyptian, and it's happened since. And so some scholars are now suggesting she had been a liturgical musician, which meant she was in a position of some leadership in the church. The church was moving towards organized, really not a hierarchy, but moving towards a more organized set of offices. And she was probably the equivalent of a deacon if she hadn't already been ordained a deacon, because being a liturgical musician, as it was and has been in Judaism, is a rather important position. So some are suggesting that she was accused of sexual sin or accused of seducing men, even though it might not have been her own fault. And rather than continuing to be a source of sin to men, she leaves. Or two, the more likely is there was an accusation against her of fornication, and therefore she got removed from leadership, most likely so a guy could step in and take over. And she goes out into the desert. But a marvelous story emerges in the desert. She does go out into the desert. She's like other desert ascetics, she's reciting the Psalms. She's singing praises to God. She's spending long times in silence. As the story goes, as she tells her own story, she admits that for the first some years, she really wrestled with her new situation and remembering life in Jerusalem and remembering life in Egypt and how lovely it was. You know, letting go of the past, and we have to let go of things in the past if we're going to make room for a new future. And this was probably part of Mary of the Egyptians' story, was one of clearing space, letting go of dreams, letting go of her past, good or bad, or a mixture of both, to make room for the new, which is what God was trying to bless her with out into the desert. And so she spends many years in the desert. Another interesting note is that Mary seems to attribute some of the gospel that she received from creation, from nature itself, that she saw God, the divine, the gospel, the good news in creation itself. And that is not an unusual motif for many of the desert ascetics, who had a great respect for the environment, had a great respect for how God is present in the midst of creation, something that we need to learn again today. But she's the great example of penthos, of repentance. As she spends decades in the desert, she eventually is found out by a dude by the name of Zosimus of Palestine. Basically, Zosimus was a priest monk in a monastery. He began to feel like, after a lifetime in the monastery, that he had attained perfection in everything and needed no teaching from anyone. So he asked himself, can there possibly be found among the wisdom-loving men of the desert one surpassing me, either in active life or in contemplation? So he sets out into the desert to found another monastery, more to his liking, of course. What is it we humans do? Try to run away from ourselves, and what do we encounter? Ourselves. But he does say that humility and prayer are what's considered most noteworthy about his new monastery, the one he hopes for. This is when he encounters Mary. God decides to intervene in his life. So Mary had confessed to the Blessed Virgin Mary. She then confesses to Zosimus her alleged sin. But he recognizes in her a holiness that is far beyond anything he had ever hoped to attain in his life. Now, when the encounter happens, she's apparently quite old. She's got her hair down to her ankles. She's just never cut it in all the years that she's been in the desert. She's in fact considered the new John the Baptist, and that's part of the reason why her story was so popular. Eating locusts and honey and wearing animal skins and, long unkempt hair and all of that sort of thing. And she won't let him come near him. In fact, she runs away, he chases after her, she continues to run away, he chases after her. They finally meet across the dry riverbed. She has her back to him and she demands his cloak, and he rolls up and tosses his cloak to her, which she wraps around herself, and then she is willing to meet with him. And she kneels before him and he kneels before her, and now we have a contest of who is the holier person, because he's seeking her blessing and she's seeking his blessing. She happens to know, and he doesn't know why, that he's actually a priest, and he says, but you're holier than I am. And so they get into this contest and they end up blessing each other in the end. But this penthos is about surrendering to something more positive, something new. It's about mercy and God's desire to extend great mercy to us. Mary's story does paint up a picture of a lifelong journey and this is something monastics would have been familiar with, and we still are today. One aspect of our monastic promise is conversion of life, and it's lifelong, right up to the very end and the last gasping breath we breathe, that our dedication, as much as we are able, is to the ongoing transformation, conversion of our life. But although God has to lead the dance and our call is to follow. But it's very much an understanding of a monastic theology. As I said, conversatio moral. It's about humility, because it turns out Zosimus was deeply convicted when he met her and recognized that she was actually the spiritual giant and not he, and that he had a lot to learn, including about humility, because a humble person, which is not about humiliation, knows they always have something to learn in life. We never will know it all. And the sisters in my monastery have been a great example of, in their 90s, and they're still debating theology and political issues and things going on in life. They're constantly learning, which something I really admire about them. She, in the end, epitomizes wisdom, and that's ultimately why she is remembered in the Byzantine tradition. She loved wisdom. She sought wisdom in her relationship with the divine, in relationship with the desert around her. But she's considered a secret wisdom saint. That means she was an illuminator, a guide, a figure linking people to God. That the true saints are the ones whose wisdom precedes them and is not based upon, anything proud. Hers is a story about the possibility of second chances and the hope of salvation. That even if it's the version where she had lived quite a lascivious life for 17 years, she was able to receive God's mercy, God's forgiveness, and turn her life completely around. There is no sin that we cannot be forgiven for, is what her story tells us. She is an expression of true humility. She's a humble, secret, unknown, God-fearing, and loving woman, is how she is remembered. She's remembered in the Byzantine tradition, our Orthodox neighbors, on the Sunday before Palm Sunday, as well as the previous Thursday. I want to make an interesting connection, though, and that's with Mary of Magdala. And many of you probably know Mary Magdala, who's in all four of the Gospels. She's one of the followers of Jesus. Quite frankly, she's one of the smarter, wiser followers of Jesus. She's mentioned 12 times. Luke mentions that she was a financial supporter of Jesus's ministry. Scholars today think that she actually probably was a widow and a businesswoman, and therefore had the business acumen to financially float Jesus's ministry. And the 12 guys, and of course there are more than 12, but the 12 that were following Jesus around were mostly came across as bumbling idiots, which is why we can relate to them so easily. Although they say that, 7 demons were driven out of her, we don't know what to make of that today. And it can mean many different things. And no one position is the absolute. But by Middle Ages, she gets starting to be marked as a reformed prostitute. What happens is, although she is remembered as the apostle to the apostles and the first witness to the resurrection, and that goes from the earliest times. But I'm afraid that by 591, dear Gregory the Great, who wrote the life of Benedict, so, he has a part of my heart there, but he gave a homily in which he identified Mary of Magdala also as being the unnamed sinner of Luke, of Mary of Bethany and John, and the woman from Mark who had 7 demons cast out of her. History, not too long after the Jesus movement, started mushing all these different Marys, unnamed women, mush them all together into one person. And for heaven's sake, why would we assume that the unnamed sinner who anointed Jesus's feet was somehow evil, let alone sexual sin? I mean, it's a reference that we're all sinners. We all fall short of God, but we make this assumption where women are concerned that somehow it's sexual. Little projection going on there. But dear Gregory manages to smash them all together into one person, and that will carry on throughout history. If you go into the Vatican Library, the Vatican museums, and you go to the section with the earliest preserved artwork that the Vatican has, Christian, not the pre-Christian stuff, you'll find in there a board with a painted picture of a woman, and she's wearing lions, animal skin. She's got real long hair down to the waist. She's very emaciated. Classic early image of Mary the Egyptian, but instead they've mislabeled it as Mary of Magdala because of dear old Pope Gregory the Great, who turned her into, this massive sinner. What is a possibility is that the 7 demons that Scripture mentions Mary of Magdala was delivered of was also a reference in Gregory's mind as an example of the 7 great sins that can lead us down. Pride, anger, gluttony. We don't need to go through all of that. But that he meant it metaphorically and it got literalized, which is very possible. And so what I want to encourage you to think about, I do tell her story in greater length in The Forgotten Desert Mothers, but you might want to consider Mary the Egyptian and the place that she has in our life today as we're living in, quite colorful times about Pentecost. Is there anything that we can be forgiven for? Yes, everything. Of the importance of humility, of the importance of letting nature preach the gospel to us, of having alone time. Don't have to go into a desert like Mary the Egyptian, but can we take some time each day for total silence to be present to the Holy One that's in our midst at all time? Mary the Egyptian.